A whisper in the woods. The woods stretched endlessly beyond the small town of Middleton, a place where secrets and whispers seemed to drift among the trees. For young Daniel Harper, the forest was his escape, a sanctuary of towering oaks and whispering pines where he spent countless afternoons exploring. At only 13, his curiosity was boundless, and his trusty camera hung around his neck, ready to capture anything fascinating for his budding nature blog. That evening, the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the trees. Daniel trudged through the dense underbrush, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. He'd come to photograph a hawk's nest he'd spotted earlier, hoping for a shot that would impress his biology teacher. But as he ventured deeper, a sound brought him to a halt. A faint hum, like the murmur of voices. Daniel froze, his ears straining. The sound grew louder, distinct now, a conversation carried on the wind. The tone was tense, clipped. He crouched low, his heart thudding as he crept closer, drawn by equal parts curiosity and unease. Through the gaps in the foliage, he spotted two figures. Their uniforms immediately caught his eye. Police officers. The taller one, Officer Brett Carson, stood with his arms crossed, his face stern and shadowed by the brim of his hat. The other, Officer Victor Haynes, was visibly anxious, glancing over his shoulder as he shoved a shovel into the earth. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Haynes muttered, his voice trembling. Carson's jaw tightened. "Just keep digging. The quicker this is done, the better." Daniel's stomach churned. The scene before him was far from routine. Nearby lay a large, lumpy tarp stained dark with something he couldn't identify. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. "What if someone finds it?" Haynes whispered, his voice cracking as he wiped sweat from his brow. "They won't," Carson snapped. "And if they do, they won't live long enough to report it. Now stop whining and finish the job." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. His hands gripped the bark of a tree for balance, the rough surface grounding him in the midst of his rising panic. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to flee back to the safety of his home. Yet he remained rooted, unable to look away. The men continued their grim work, the shovel striking the earth with hollow thuds. Carson paced nearby, his eyes scanning the woods with sharp precision. Daniel barely dared to breathe, his small frame pressed tightly against the ground. But as he shifted his weight, a twig snapped beneath his foot. The sharp crack cut through the tension like a gunshot. Carson's head jerked toward the sound, his hand immediately reaching for his holstered weapon. "Did you hear that?" Carson barked, his voice low but dangerous. Haynes froze, gripping the shovel tightly. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Animals don't break twigs like that," Carson growled. He took a step toward the trees, his dark eyes scanning the dense underbrush. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he was sure they would hear it. He pressed himself closer to the ground, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Carson's boots crunched against the forest floor as he took another step closer, his gaze piercing the shadows. After a long moment, he stopped and exhaled sharply. "Let's finish this and get out of here," he said, turning back to the grave. "If someone's out there, we'll deal with it later." Daniel waited until the sound of their shovels resumed, then slowly began inching backward. His limbs trembled as he moved, careful to avoid making another sound. It felt like an eternity before he was far enough away to risk standing. When he did, he ran, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. The sun had set by the time Daniel burst into his house, the screen door slamming behind him. His mother, Claire Harper, turned from the kitchen sink, startled by the noise. "Daniel, what on earth?" "Mom," he gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to find the words. I saw something. In the woods. 2 cops. They were burying something." Claire frowned, setting down the dish she was drying. "What are you talking about?" "It was a body," Daniel blurted out, his voice shaking. "I think they buried a body." The color drained from Claire's face. She knelt in front of her son, gripping his shoulders tightly. "Daniel, slow down. Are you absolutely sure about this?" "I know what I saw," he insisted, his wide eyes glistening with tears. "They were digging a grave, Mom. And they said if someone found it, they'd kill them." Claire's mind raced. She glanced toward the living room, where her husband, Mark, sat flipping through a newspaper. "Mark," she called out, her voice urgent. Mark appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Claire quickly explained, her voice low and hurried. Mark listened intently, his expression darkening with each word. When she finished, he ran a hand over his face, his jaw tight. "Did anyone see you, Daniel?" he asked sharply. "I don't think so," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hiding the whole time." Mark exchanged a tense look with Claire. "We can't report this," he said finally. "What?" Claire exclaimed. "Mark, we can't just." "We have no proof," Mark interrupted. "And you know how this town works. Those officers have connections. If they find out Daniel saw something, they'll come after us." "So what do we do?" Claire demanded, her voice rising with frustration. Mark hesitated before answering, his tone grim. "We keep quiet, and we make sure Daniel stays far away from those woods." Daniel stared at his parents, disbelief and anger mingling in his chest. "But they killed someone," he protested. "We can't just let them get away with it." Claire placed a hand on his cheek, her voice soft but firm. "Sweetheart, sometimes doing the right thing is dangerous. And right now, we have to think about keeping you safe." Daniel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He didn't understand. He couldn't. How could his parents stand by and do nothing? But as he looked into their fearful eyes, he realized they wouldn't budge. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, the image of the bloody tarp haunted him. He clenched his fists, a new determination building within him. His parents might be too afraid to act, but he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. Someone had to bring the truth to light, even if it meant risking everything. Secrets and shadows. The following morning, the Harper household was subdued, the weight of unspoken tension pressing heavily in the air. Daniel picked at his breakfast, his appetite completely gone. His parents exchanged quiet, worried glances, their whispered conversations from the night before lingering in his mind. They'd wanted him to forget what he'd seen, but how could he? The horrifying memory refused to fade, replaying in vivid detail every time he closed his eyes. At school, Daniel kept his head down. The usual buzz of chatter in the cafeteria and the clanging of lockers felt distant, muffled. His best friend, Lucas, immediately noticed his unusual silence. "Hey," Lucas said, sliding onto the bench beside him. "You okay? You've been acting weird all morning." Daniel hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the lunch tray. He wanted to tell someone, to let the words spill out, but his parents' warnings echoed in his mind. Still, the secret felt too heavy to carry alone. "I saw something," Daniel whispered, leaning closer. His voice trembled, but he pressed on. "In the woods yesterday. Something bad." Lucas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of bad? Did you find a dead animal or something?" Daniel shook his head. "Worse. 2 cops were out there. They were burying something. Someone, I think." Lucas blinked, his mouth falling open. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. "I saw the tarp. It was bloody. They were talking about making sure no one found out." Lucas leaned back, his expression shifting between disbelief and alarm. "What did your parents say?" "They told me to forget about it," Daniel muttered bitterly. "They think it's too dangerous to do anything." Lucas frowned, then glanced around the noisy cafeteria. "Okay, but you can't just ignore something like that. What if they're still out there, covering it up? Someone needs to stop them." Daniel looked at his friend, his heart racing. He knew Lucas was right. If he didn't do something, no one would. But the thought of returning to the woods, of coming face to face with those officers, filled him with dread. "I can't go back there alone," Daniel admitted, his voice shaky. "What if they catch me?" Lucas grinned, though there was a nervous edge to it. "You're not going alone. We'll go together. We just need to be smart about it." Daniel nodded, his stomach twisting. He didn't feel brave, but the thought of letting the officers get away with their crime was unbearable. That afternoon, Daniel and Lucas met at their usual spot near the bike racks after school. Lucas had packed a backpack with supplies, a flashlight, snacks, gloves, and a notebook. "Why the notebook?" Daniel asked as they rode toward the edge of the woods. "In case we find anything important," Lucas explained. "We'll write it all down. You know, evidence." The sun hung low in the sky as they entered the forest, the golden light filtering through the trees. The once familiar trails now felt ominous, each rustle of leaves making Daniel's pulse quicken. Lucas seemed equally on edge, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. As they approached the site, Daniel's steps slowed. The disturbed earth was still visible, the crude grave poorly concealed beneath a thin layer of leaves and branches. His stomach churned at the sight. "This is it," he whispered. Lucas knelt beside the grave, his expression grim. "They didn't even try to hide it properly," he muttered. "What do you think is in there?" "A body," Daniel replied, his voice hollow. "I heard them talking about it. They said no one would find it." Lucas reached into his backpack and pulled out a small trowel. "We need to dig, just a little. If we can see what's under there, we'll know for sure." Daniel hesitated. The idea of disturbing the grave felt wrong, but he nodded. Together, they began scraping away the top layer of soil. The damp earth clung to their hands, the smell thick and cloying. After a few minutes, Lucas froze, his hand trembling as he uncovered something beneath the dirt, a scrap of fabric. It was stained dark, the color unmistakable. "Stop," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "That's enough." Lucas sat back, his face pale. Okay, you're right. We've seen enough." Daniel quickly covered the grave again, his hands trembling as he scattered leaves over the disturbed soil. His heart pounded as he looked around, half expecting the officers to emerge from the shadows. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. As they turned to leave, a low rumble reached their ears, the unmistakable sound of a car engine. Daniel's blood ran cold. He grabbed Lucas's arm, pulling him toward the underbrush. "Hide," he hissed. The boys dove into the bushes just as a patrol car rolled into view. It stopped a few yards away, the headlights slicing through the trees. Daniel peeked through the foliage, his breath shallow. Officer Carson stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate. He scanned the area, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. A moment later, Haynes emerged from the passenger side, looking nervous as ever. "You said it was untouched," Carson growled, his sharp eyes sweeping over the grave. "It was," Haynes stammered. "I checked this morning. No one's been here." Carson didn't look convinced. He walked over to the grave, nudging the soil with the toe of his boot. "Something's off," he muttered. "This doesn't look the same." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as Carson knelt down, his gloved hand brushing away some of the leaves. The officer's jaw tightened. "Someone's been here," Carson said coldly. He stood abruptly, his eyes scanning the woods. "Whoever it was, they won't get far." Haynes fidgeted, glancing toward the trees. "What do we do?" Carson's expression hardened. "We find them. And we make sure they don't talk." Daniel and Lucas exchanged terrified looks. The woods had never felt so claustrophobic, the towering trees now seeming like prison bars. They didn't dare move, their breaths shallow as they waited for the officers to leave. Carson lingered for what felt like an eternity, his eyes darting toward the bushes where the boys were hiding. Finally, he turned back to Haynes. "We'll come back tonight. Carson said. "Bring shovels. If they've seen anything, they'll come back too. And when they do, we'll be ready." The officers climbed back into the car and drove away, the engine's growl fading into the distance. Only then did Daniel and Lucas emerge from their hiding spot, their limbs trembling. "We have to go," Lucas said, his voice shaky. Now, they sprinted back to their bikes, their fear driving them faster than ever. By the time they reached Daniel's house, their lungs burned and their legs ached, but they didn't stop until they were safely inside. "What are we going to do?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they were in far deeper than they'd ever anticipated, and the officers weren't going to stop until their secret stayed buried. A web of fear. Daniel stared out of his bedroom window that night, the events of the day replaying in his mind like a relentless storm. The uncovered fabric, the officers' sharp words, and the patrol car prowling the woods. It all painted a picture darker than he'd ever imagined. He clutched his camera tightly, his knuckles white as he fought to steady his breathing. The gravity of what they'd stumbled into was finally sinking in. Downstairs, his parents were deep in conversation. Their muffled voices carried through the walls, but he couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. The tension in the house was palpable, a silent weight pressing down on all of them. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't have all the details. But Daniel couldn't tell them. Not now. They were already scared enough. He glanced at the notebook Lucas had left behind, filled with hastily scribbled notes and a rough sketch of the burial site. It felt like holding evidence from a crime scene, a piece of a puzzle too dangerous to solve. The next morning, the unease in the Harper household was impossible to ignore. Claire watched Daniel over breakfast, her brow furrowed with concern. "You didn't sleep well," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Daniel shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine." Mark entered the room, his expression grim. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, leaning down so their eyes met. "Son, if there's something on your mind, you can tell us. We're here for you." Daniel hesitated, torn between the urge to confide in them and the fear of putting them in even greater danger. "It's nothing," he muttered, quickly excusing himself from the table. He grabbed his backpack and bolted out the door before they could press further. As he rode his bike to school, Daniel's thoughts raced. Lucas was waiting for him at their usual meeting spot near the bike racks, his face pale and tense. "You okay?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Lucas shook his head. "No, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those cops, what they said, what they'll do if they find out it was us." Daniel nodded grimly. "We have to be careful. No one else can know." "Not yet." Lucas looked skeptical. "What about your parents? Maybe they could help." Daniel hesitated. "They're scared enough as it is. They wouldn't let me do anything. They'd just try to stop me." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, what's the plan? We can't just ignore this." Daniel pulled out the notebook. "We need proof. Something solid. If we can record them going back to the grave, we'll have evidence." Lucas's eyes widened. "You're talking about going back? After what happened yesterday?" "They said they'd be there tonight," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "If we catch them in the act, they won't be able to deny it." Lucas stared at him, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but we're doing this carefully." That evening, Daniel packed his camera, a flashlight, and a spare battery into his backpack. He waited until his parents were distracted before slipping out the back door, his heart pounding with every step. Lucas was waiting for him at the edge of the woods, his own flashlight in hand. "This is insane," Lucas muttered as they made their way through the trees. "You know that, right?" Daniel didn't respond. His focus was laser-sharp, every sound in the forest amplified by his heightened nerves. The sky above was a deep inky blue, the faint glow of the moon their only light. Shadows stretched and shifted around them, turning every tree into a potential threat. When they reached the burial site, they crouched low, hiding behind a cluster of bushes. Daniel set up his camera, pointing it toward the disturbed patch of earth. He adjusted the focus, his hands trembling as he tightened the tripod. "Now we wait," he whispered. Time dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. The silence of the woods was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Lucas fidgeted beside him, his nerves clearly fraying. Then, in the distance, the faint rumble of an engine. Daniel's pulse quickened as he peeked through the foliage. A pair of headlights pierced the darkness, growing brighter as the patrol car approached. It stopped a few yards away, the engine cutting off with a low growl. Carson stepped out first, his flashlight cutting sharp beams through the trees. He scanned the area methodically, his movements deliberate. Haynes followed reluctantly, clutching a shovel like it might shield him from whatever horrors lay ahead. "This better be quick," Haynes muttered. "I don't like being out here." "Shut up and dig," Carson snapped, tossing him the shovel. "We need to make sure nothing's been tampered with." Haynes hesitated but obeyed, stabbing the shovel into the soft earth. The sound sent chills down Daniel's spine. He pressed record on his camera, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Someone's been here," Carson said, his voice low and dangerous. "Look at this. The ground's been disturbed." Haynes froze, his hands tightening around the shovel. "You think they found something?" "Doesn't matter," Carson said. "If they did, we'll find them. And we'll deal with them." Daniel's hands trembled as he adjusted the camera, desperate to capture every word. His heart felt like it might explode, the fear nearly overwhelming him. He glanced at Lucas, whose wide eyes mirrored his own terror. Suddenly, Carson's flashlight swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. The boys ducked lower, their bodies pressed tightly to the ground. Daniel held his breath, every muscle in his body screaming to run. "Who's there?" Carson barked, his flashlight now pointed directly at the bushes. "Come out." Daniel's mind raced. Should they run? Stay hidden? The decision was made for them when Lucas's foot shifted, snapping a twig beneath him. The sound was deafening in the stillness. "There," Carson shouted, drawing his gun. Daniel grabbed Lucas's arm, yanking him to his feet. "Run," he shouted. They bolted through the trees, the beam of Carson's flashlight chasing them. Adrenaline coursed through Daniel's veins as he sprinted faster than he ever thought possible. Branches clawed at his face and arms, but he didn't stop. Behind them, Carson's voice roared, "You can't hide from me." Daniel's lungs burned, his legs screaming for relief. But he pushed on, his grip on Lucas's arm tightening as they navigated the dark forest. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but they didn't dare slow down. Finally, they broke through the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the grass near the road. Daniel's chest heaved as he gasped for air, his entire body trembling. Lucas lay beside him, equally breathless. "We got it," Daniel wheezed, clutching his camera. "We have proof." Lucas nodded, his face pale but determined. "Now what?" Daniel stared at the camera, the weight of their actions settling over him. "Now," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him, "we show the world what they've done." Unbeknownst to them, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly creeping toward them. The danger was far from over. The price of truth. Daniel and Lucas stared at the oncoming headlights, frozen in terror. The road stretched out before them, illuminated by the dim moonlight, while the ominous glow of the approaching car grew brighter with each passing second. Daniel clutched his camera tightly, his mind racing. "Get up," Lucas hissed, yanking Daniel to his feet. The boys scrambled toward the ditch on the side of the road, diving into the tall grass just as the car slowed to a crawl. They pressed themselves flat against the ground, their breaths shallow. Daniel peeked through the blades of grass, his heart pounding. The car was unmarked but sleek, the kind that didn't belong on the quiet backroads of Middleton. The windows were tinted, and the license plate was obscured by dirt. The driver turned off the headlights, plunging the area into darkness. "Do you think they saw us?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel whispered back, gripping the camera like it was a lifeline. The car idled for what felt like an eternity. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Finally, the car sped off, leaving the boys lying in silence. Daniel exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling. "We need to get out of here." Lucas nodded, and they carefully climbed out of the ditch, their legs unsteady as they made their way back to Daniel's house. They rode in silence, every rustle of leaves and distant sound making them jump. By the time they arrived, it was nearly midnight. Inside the Harper home, Claire was pacing the living room, her face etched with worry. When the door creaked open, she spun around, her eyes widening in relief. "Daniel," she exclaimed, rushing toward him. "Where have you been? Do you have any idea how worried I've been?" "I'm fine," Daniel muttered, brushing past her. "I was with Lucas." "Fine," Claire repeated, her voice rising. "You're covered in dirt, and you've been gone for hours. What's going on?" Mark appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Daniel, sit down," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Daniel sat on the couch, Lucas hovering awkwardly by the door. The notebook peeked out of Daniel's backpack, and the camera strap dangled from his hand. Mark's eyes narrowed as he noticed them. "What's in the bag?" Mark asked. "Nothing," Daniel said quickly, trying to hide it. Mark reached over and snatched the bag from his son's hands, unzipping it with a sharp motion. He pulled out the camera and notebook, his face darkening as he flipped through the pages and examined the device. "Is this what I think it is?" Mark demanded. "You went back to the woods, didn't you?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I had to," he said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't just do nothing." Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Daniel, do you realize how dangerous that was?" "I know," Daniel admitted, "but I got proof. Look." He reached for the camera and turned it on, navigating to the footage they had captured. The screen lit up, showing the grainy video of Carson and Haynes at the burial site. Their voices were muffled but clear enough to understand. "Someone's been here," Carson said on the recording. "If they've seen anything, we'll deal with them." Claire sank onto the couch, her face pale. Mark's jaw tightened as he watched the footage, his hands gripping the camera tightly. "This is serious," Mark said finally. "We can't keep this to ourselves." "But what can we do?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "If those officers find out we have this, they'll come after us. You've seen what they're capable of." Mark set the camera down and rubbed his temples. "We need help. Someone outside of Middleton. Someone who can expose this without putting us in more danger." "What about Sarah?" Daniel suggested, his voice tentative. "Didn't you say she used to be a detective?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Sarah Mitchell," he said. "She's been digging into police corruption for years. If anyone can help, it's her." Sarah Mitchell's name carried weight in the Harper household. She was a former detective turned independent investigator who had spent her career taking on powerful figures and uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. She'd been forced out of the police force after blowing the whistle on corruption, but she hadn't stopped fighting. Mark wasted no time. He called Sarah the next morning, explaining everything in a rush. Sarah listened intently, her voice calm but serious. "This is dangerous, Mark," she said. "If these officers are who I think they are, they won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them." "I know," Mark said, "but we can't let them get away with this." "Send me the footage," Sarah said. "I'll see what I can do. But be careful, Mark. They'll be watching you." Mark agreed and sent the footage immediately, his heart pounding as he clicked send. He turned to Claire, who was sitting on the couch with Daniel, her face pale. "She'll help us," Mark said, though his voice lacked confidence. "We just need to be careful." Meanwhile, Carson and Haynes were growing more paranoid. The gravesite had been tampered with, and the keychain Haynes had found near the scene, a cheap trinket with the name Daniel etched onto it, was a clue they couldn't ignore. Carson sat in his office, staring at the keychain on his desk. His jaw clenched as he replayed the events in his mind. Someone had been in the woods, and he needed to find out who. Haynes, Carson barked, motioning for his partner to come in. Haynes entered, his shoulders hunched. "What's the plan?" Carson picked up the keychain and held it up. "We find this kid, and we make sure he doesn't cause any more problems." Haynes paled. "You're not serious, are you? He's just a kid." Carson's glare was ice cold. "Do you think they'll care how old he is when this blows up in our faces? If we don't shut this down, we're finished." Haynes swallowed hard but nodded. "I'll look into it." That evening, the Harper family received an unexpected visitor. The knock at the door was sharp, deliberate. Mark glanced at Claire, his gut twisting. He motioned for her to stay back and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, Detective Carson stood on the porch, his professional smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Mr. Harper," Carson said smoothly, "I'm here about a matter involving your son, Daniel." Mark's blood ran cold, but he forced a neutral expression. "What about him?" Carson's gaze sharpened. "We found something near a site we were investigating. A keychain with his name on it. I wanted to ask if he's been in the woods recently." Mark tightened his grip on the door. "Daniel's just a kid. He plays outside sometimes, but he hasn't been in the woods." Carson's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so? Well, if you see him with anything unusual, like a camera or notes, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. We're investigating a sensitive matter." Mark nodded stiffly. "Of course." As soon as Carson left, Mark slammed the door and turned to Claire. "We're out of time," he said, his voice shaking. "They know." Claire's face was pale, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" Mark set his jaw. "We fight. But we'll need help to survive what's coming." The thin edge of courage. The house was cloaked in a tense silence after Carson's visit. Mark paced the living room, his fists clenching and unclenching as he tried to think of a way to protect his family. Claire sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor, and Daniel leaned against the wall, his face pale but determined. "They know about me," Daniel whispered. "They found my keychain." Mark turned to his son, his eyes blazing. "You don't go anywhere alone from now on. Do you understand me? If they're watching us, we have to stay together." Daniel nodded, but his stomach churned with guilt. His determination to expose the truth had put his family in danger, and now it felt like there was no way out. "We need a plan," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "We can't stay here. If they think we're a threat, they'll come for us." "Where can we go?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. "They'll find us wherever we run." Mark stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "Not if we have leverage. If Sarah can get this story out fast enough, it'll put them on the defensive. They won't risk coming after us if they know the world is watching." Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Sarah Mitchell was working frantically. The footage Mark had sent her was damning, clear enough to prove that Carson and Haynes were involved in something illegal. But it wasn't enough to expose the full extent of their corruption. Sarah needed more, and time was running out. Her walls were covered in documents, photos, and notes, a chaotic map of connections and leads. She pored over old case files, piecing together a pattern of misconduct that traced back years. Carson had been untouchable for too long, protected by powerful allies in the department. But this time, Sarah was determined to take him down. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. It was Mark. "They're onto us," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. Carson came to the house. "He knows about Daniel." Sarah's chest tightened. "That's not good. Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," Mark replied. "But he didn't have to. He knows we have the footage." Sarah exhaled slowly, her mind racing. "You need to get somewhere safe. I'll keep working on my end, but I need something stronger to bring to the press. Do you have anything else? Anything that ties Carson to a larger network?" Mark hesitated. "There's a reporter named Charlie Hensley. He disappeared a few months ago, but before that, he was investigating police corruption in Middleton. He might have been onto something big." Sarah's stomach dropped at the name. "Charlie's dead," she said grimly. "I suspected it for months, but I couldn't prove it. If Carson and Haynes buried him, that's the connection we need." Back at the Harper house, Daniel couldn't sit still. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and frustration. He hated feeling powerless, like there was nothing he could do to help. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the footage they'd captured might not be enough. They needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be buried or dismissed. "What if we go back?" Daniel blurted out, breaking the heavy silence. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she said firmly. "Absolutely not." "Hear me out," Daniel said, stepping forward. "They're going to move the body, right? That's what they were talking about. If we can catch them in the act, it'll prove everything." Mark shook his head. "It's too dangerous, Daniel. They're already watching us." "They won't expect us to go back," Daniel argued. "And if we don't do something, they'll cover this up for good." Claire stood, her voice rising with panic. "I won't let you risk your life for this. You're just a child, Daniel." "I'm the one who saw it," Daniel shot back, his voice breaking. "I'm the reason they're after us. I have to finish this." Mark stepped between them, his expression torn. "Claire, he's right. If we don't act now, we'll lose our chance." Claire stared at her husband in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You want to send our son into danger." "I don't want to," Mark said softly. "But this might be our only shot." That night, as the town slept, Daniel and Mark prepared for their risky mission. Claire refused to speak to them, her silent disapproval like a heavy weight in the room. Daniel hugged her tightly before they left, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. "I'll be okay, Mom," he whispered. "I promise." Claire didn't reply, her tears falling silently as she watched them go. The woods were eerily silent as Daniel and Mark crept through the trees, their flashlights flickering against the dense shadows. The burial site was just ahead, the disturbed earth barely visible in the faint moonlight. They crouched behind a thicket, their breaths shallow as they waited. Time seemed to crawl, each minute stretching into an eternity. Then, the faint hum of an engine reached their ears. "They're here," Mark whispered. The patrol car pulled into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Carson and Haynes stepped out, their movements tense and purposeful. Carson barked orders as Haynes began digging, his shovel striking the earth with a hollow thud. Daniel's heart raced as he adjusted the camera, his trembling hands barely able to keep it steady. He focused on the grave, zooming in on the officers' faces as they worked. This was the proof they needed, the undeniable evidence that would expose their crimes. But just as Daniel pressed record, Carson froze. His head snapped up, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. "Someone's here," Carson said, his voice low and dangerous. Mark grabbed Daniel's arm. "We have to move. Now." They backed away slowly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. But Carson's flashlight swept toward them, the beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. "There!" Carson shouted, drawing his gun. Panic surged through Daniel as he and Mark broke into a sprint, weaving through the trees as Carson's shouts echoed behind them. The flashlight's beam danced wildly, and the crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, his legs burning with effort. Mark stayed close, his protective instincts overriding his fear. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the pavement. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Daniel nodded, clutching the camera tightly. "I got it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got everything." Back at the Harper house, Claire was waiting anxiously by the window. When she saw Daniel and Mark stumble through the door, relief washed over her. "You're safe," she whispered, pulling them into a tight embrace. But her relief was short-lived when she saw the fear etched into their faces. "They know we were there," Mark said grimly. "They won't stop until they find us." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now?" Mark looked at Daniel, then at the camera in his hands. "We finish this, tonight." With their backs against the wall, the Harpers prepared to release the footage to Sarah and the press. They knew it would spark a storm, but it was their only hope of exposing the truth and surviving the night. Truth unleashed. The night felt heavier than usual, the oppressive stillness broken only by the faint hum of cicadas outside the Harper house. Inside, the tension was palpable. Daniel sat at the dining table, the camera in front of him, its screen displaying the damning footage he'd risked everything to capture. Mark hovered behind him, his hands clenched into fists. Claire stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield, her face pale and drawn. "We send it to Sarah," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. "She'll know how to handle it." Daniel nodded, his fingers trembling as he transferred the footage to a secure drive. He glanced at his mother, whose expression was a mixture of fear and resignation. "This is the right thing to do, Mom," he said softly. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered, "but it doesn't make it any less terrifying." Mark grabbed his laptop and opened the encrypted email client Sarah had set up for them earlier that day. With precise movements, he attached the footage and typed a brief message. "Sarah, this is everything. Carson and Haynes at the grave. Get it out there before they find us." Mark. He hovered over the send button for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Then, with a deep breath, he clicked it. The email disappeared into cyberspace, carrying their last shred of hope with it. "It's done," Mark said, his voice heavy. Miles away, Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed. She grabbed it from her cluttered desk, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read Mark's message. A rush of adrenaline coursed through her as she opened the file. The footage played on her screen, and by the time it ended, she was already making calls. "This is it," she murmured to herself. "This is the proof I've been waiting for." Sarah's first call was to a trusted journalist at a national news outlet. She knew the stakes were high, but she also knew that Carson's network of corruption couldn't reach beyond Middleton if the story went public fast enough. The journalist promised to move quickly, and within an hour, Sarah sent the footage along with a detailed report of Carson's history. As the story began to spread, Sarah turned her attention back to the Harpers. She called Mark immediately. "It's out," she said when he answered. "The footage, the story, it's live. They can't bury this now." Mark's relief was evident, but his voice remained cautious. "That's good, but we're not safe yet, are we?" "No," Sarah admitted. "Carson won't go down without a fight. You need to be ready for anything." At the police station, Carson slammed his fist onto his desk, his face a mask of fury. The footage had reached the local news, and from there, it had spread like wildfire. Every screen in the station seemed to display his face at the grave, his words damning him in high definition. "This is a setup," Carson snarled, pacing his office. "Someone's framing me." Haynes sat in a chair, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Aaron, this is bad. They've got us. We should." "Shut up," Carson barked, glaring at his partner. "You don't panic on me now, Tom. We still have a chance to fix this." Haynes swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Carson's eyes narrowed. "We find the Harpers. If they're the ones who leaked this, we make sure they regret it." The Harpers' phone rang again, and Mark answered on the first ring. It was Sarah. "Turn on the news," she said quickly, "and lock your doors." Mark grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The footage was everywhere now, the words "police corruption exposed" flashing across the screen. A polished anchor explained the story in clipped tones, emphasizing the bravery of the anonymous whistleblowers who had come forward. "It's working," Daniel whispered, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. But then the house phone rang. This time, Mark hesitated before picking it up. When he finally did, a cold, familiar voice greeted him. "Mr. Harper," Carson said, his tone deceptively calm. "I think we need to talk." Mark's blood ran cold. "There's nothing to talk about, Carson." "Oh, I think there is," Carson replied, his voice tightening. "You see, you've put yourself in a very dangerous position. That footage won't mean much if the people who leaked it mysteriously disappear, will it?" Mark gripped the phone tightly, his jaw clenching. "You won't get away with this. Everyone's watching now." Carson chuckled darkly. "They may be watching, but they can't protect you. Not tonight." The line went dead. Mark hung up the phone and turned to Claire and Daniel, his face ashen. "We need to leave. Now." The family scrambled to pack what they could, throwing essentials into backpacks. Mark kept glancing out the window, his heart pounding as every shadow seemed to move. Claire grabbed a framed photo of the family, her hands shaking as she stuffed it into her bag. As they loaded into the car, headlights appeared at the end of the street. Mark froze, his hand on the door handle. "Get in," he said sharply. Daniel climbed into the back seat, clutching the camera tightly. Claire slid into the passenger seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Mark started the engine, the car roaring to life. He sped out of the driveway just as the headlights began to move toward them. He turned sharply onto a side street, the tires screeching against the asphalt. "They're following us," Claire said, her voice trembling. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel. "I know." The unmarked car gained on them quickly, its engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. Mark swerved onto a back road, the forest looming on either side. The family's breaths came in panicked gasps as the car behind them closed the distance. Daniel glanced out the rear window, his heart racing. "They're getting closer." Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to lose them. The narrow road offered little in the way of escape. Just as the headlights drew closer, a sudden burst of light flooded the road ahead. A line of patrol cars appeared, their sirens blaring and their lights flashing. Mark slammed on the brakes as the unmarked car behind them skidded to a halt. Officers surrounded Carson's vehicle, their guns drawn. Mark stared in disbelief as Carson stepped out of the car, his hands raised, but his expression defiant. Haynes followed, his face pale and defeated. From one of the patrol cars, Sarah Mitchell stepped out, her face set with determination. She approached Mark's car and knocked on the window. Mark rolled it down, his voice shaking. "How did you?" "I told you to be ready for anything," Sarah said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You sent me the proof, and I sent it to people who could act fast." Carson's finished. Mark exhaled heavily, relief washing over him. Claire burst into tears, clutching Daniel tightly. In the days that followed, the story continued to spread, and Carson's network of corruption unraveled. Other officers came forward, emboldened by the Harpers' bravery, exposing the full extent of the rot within the department. Carson and Haynes faced charges that would ensure they never saw freedom again. The Harpers returned to their home, the weight of fear finally lifting. Daniel sat at the dining table, his camera in front of him, but this time it wasn't evidence he was reviewing. It was a video for his school project, a tribute to the power of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. Mark and Claire watched from the doorway, their faces proud but somber. They knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope. "Sometimes," Mark said, his voice quiet, "doing the right thing comes at a cost, but it's worth it." Daniel looked up at his father, a small smile on his lips. "Yeah, it is." A new dawn. The days turned into weeks, and while the Harpers tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, the events of the past lingered in their minds like the shadows of the forest they had braved. Middleton was no longer the same town. The story of corruption and betrayal had broken through the small town's tightly controlled silence, and the ripples were felt everywhere. Carson's trial became a national spectacle. More officers from the department came forward with their own stories of coercion, blackmail, and fear. Evidence emerged that Carson's reach extended far beyond Middleton, implicating high-ranking officials who had protected him for years. Haynes, in a desperate bid for leniency, testified against Carson, providing chilling details about the crimes they had committed together. The Harpers' role. The Harpers' names remained anonymous in the media. Thanks to Sarah Mitchell's careful handling of the evidence, she had ensured their safety, working tirelessly behind the scenes to shield them from retaliation. But within the town, whispers abounded. People speculated about who had been brave or foolish enough to stand against Carson and his network. Daniel, once just a curious boy with a camera, now carried himself with quiet resilience. The fear that had once gripped him had been replaced by a sense of purpose. He still carried his camera everywhere, but now, he wasn't just capturing the beauty of the world around him. He was documenting the truth. The confrontation. One morning, while Mark was in town running errands, he found himself face to face with Tom Haynes. The former officer, now out on bail awaiting sentencing, looked haggard and worn, a far cry from the man who had once been Carson's right-hand enforcer. "You're the reason my life's in ruins," Haynes muttered, his voice low but tinged with bitterness. Mark, standing his ground, replied evenly, "No, Tom. You and Carson are the reason your life's in ruins. You could have stopped it long ago." Haynes stared at him, the weight of his choices evident in his hollow eyes. After a long pause, he whispered, "I hope you know what you've done for your family." Mark's jaw tightened. "I've done what any parent would, protected my son and stood up for what's right. You should try it sometime." Haynes said nothing, shuffling away into the shadows of his own guilt. A new chapter. Months later, the Harpers were invited to a quiet gathering in the state capitol. It was a closed ceremony, attended by journalists, law enforcement officials, and advocates for transparency and justice. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, addressing the room with the same fire and conviction that had kept her going through years of adversity. "Today, we celebrate not just the fall of corruption, but the bravery of those who stood against it," Sarah said, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "To the family who risked everything to expose the truth, your courage reminds us that even in the darkest times, doing what's right is always worth it." As Sarah gestured toward the Harpers, Daniel, Mark, and Claire stood, receiving a quiet but heartfelt ovation. Their identities remained protected from the public, but in that room, among those who understood their sacrifice, they felt a sense of closure. The woods. One day, months after the ceremony, Daniel returned to the woods alone. The forest, once a place of fear and danger, had become a symbol of his own transformation. He brought his camera, not to capture evidence, but to reclaim the peace he had once found among the trees. He stood near the spot where the grave had been uncovered, now just a patch of overgrown earth. Closing his eyes, he let the sounds of the forest wash over him. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of the town. The darkness that had once consumed this place had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of renewal. Daniel raised his camera, framing a shot of the sunlight filtering through the branches. The image wasn't just beautiful. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of standing up against injustice, and to the light that always finds its way through the shadows.